The waters at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz were tense on the morning of Tuesday, April 15th, 2026. United States Navy vessels held their positions along one of the most critical choke points on Earth, enforcing a blockade that President Donald Trump had announced just 2 days earlier. The air was thick with the kind of quiet that comes before something moves. And then something moved. A Chinese tanker called Rich Starry, sanctioned by the United States government, passed through the Strait of Hormuz on Tuesday despite the American naval blockade on the choke point. Shipping data from LSEG, Marine Traffic, and KPLR confirmed the crossing. The Rich Starry became the first vessel to make it through the strait and exit the Gulf since the blockade began. It was a moment that carried weight far beyond the movement of a single ship. It was a direct signal sent from Beijing to Washington in the language of steel and saltwater. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to go back to the beginning. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been burning since February 28, 2026. Iran had brought traffic through the Strait of Hormuz to a near-total halt in response to United States and Israeli attacks on its territory since that date. The Iranian de facto control over the choke point sent gas and petrol prices skyrocketing around the world. The strait, a narrow band of water between Iran and Oman, is the artery through which the world's energy flows. A fifth of global energy exports pass through it. When Iran locked it down, the world felt it in every fuel station, every shipping invoice, every factory floor. A 2-week ceasefire was agreed to by the United States and Iran on April 8th. But that ceasefire was fragile and the diplomacy around it was already cracking. United States Vice President J.D. Vance traveled to Islamabad, Pakistan for marathon negotiations with top Iranian officials. Any hopes that he would emerge with a deal to end the war were dashed when he left empty-handed. 21 hours of talks had produced nothing. The window for peace had closed, at least for now. President Trump announced on Sunday that the U.S. Navy would begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade was set to start at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday. Trump said the United States would use the same methods it employed against drug boats in the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean. Neutral vessels inside Iranian ports were given a grace period to leave. The message was blunt and military in its design. Washington was moving to strangle Tehran's economy by cutting off its energy revenues at the source. United States Central Command clarified that the blockade would target vessels linked to Iranian ports while allowing unhindered transit to and from non-Iranian destinations. The military phrasing was precise. CENTCOM forces would not block freedom of navigation for ships moving to and from non-Iranian ports. It was a targeted economic siege, not a full closure of the strait, but in practice, the fear and uncertainty it generated froze the waterway almost completely. Before the war began, on February 28th, about 140 ships passed through the waterway each day. A maximum of 14 a day had traveled through since the 2-week ceasefire was agreed. An estimated 230 vessels loaded with oil were stuck in the Arabian Gulf. The numbers told the story plainly. The strait had gone from a highway to a ghost route. Shipping companies, insurance underwriters, and cargo operators were watching and waiting. On Monday, the first full day of the American blockade, the Rich Starry tested the line. The 188-meter chemicals and oil products tanker turned back within minutes of approaching the choke point, according to marine traffic data. A second vessel, the 175-meter tanker Austria, also reversed course after approaching the strait. The U.S. Navy had made its presence known. 6 other merchant vessels complied with orders from American forces and turned around to re-enter an Iranian port on the Gulf of Oman. During the first 24 hours, no ships made it past the blockade. Then came Tuesday morning. The Rich Starry approached the strait again. This time, it did not turn back. The vessel, Rich Starry, which is under United States sanctions, had initially turned back late Monday before completing its passage a day later. The tanker and its owner, Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Company Limited, were sanctioned by the United States for dealing with Iran. The Rich Starry is a medium-range tanker, carrying about 250,000 barrels of methanol on board. It loaded the cargo at its last port of call, the United Arab Emirates, Hamria. The Chinese-owned tanker had a Chinese crew on board. It was not heading to an Iranian port. It was heading out of the Gulf entirely. That distinction mattered under the terms of the blockade. Because the ship was departing from a UAE port and not bound for Iran, the letter of CENTCOM's rules technically permitted its passage. But the Rich Starry was also a vessel under active United States Treasury sanctions for its prior dealings with Tehran. The fact that it sailed through anyway and that American forces did not stop it raised immediate questions about how the blockade would be enforced against sanctioned Chinese shipping. Another U.S. sanctioned tanker, Merlikishan, also headed into the strait on Tuesday. The Merlikishan had been previously used to transport both Iranian and Russian oil and was heading for Iraq, where it would load fuel oil. A third vessel, the Panama-flagged Peace Gulf, was also making its way toward the chokepoint. None of the three ships were bound for Iranian ports. Beijing responded loudly. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun said at a news conference that the United States increasing military operations and taking targeted blockade action would only exacerbate tensions and undermine the already fragile ceasefire agreement and further jeopardize the safety of passage through the strait. He described the blockade as dangerous and irresponsible behavior. China urged all parties to respect the ceasefire and remain committed to dialogue and peace talks. The pressure was coming from multiple directions. Saudi Arabia was pressing Washington to abandon the blockade and return to negotiations, fearing the move could provoke Iran into retaliating against other vital shipping lanes. United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the closure of the strait deeply damaging, saying that getting global shipping moving again was vital to easing cost of living pressures. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen echoed his concern. The International Energy Agency warned that global oil demand was expected to fall by 80,000 barrels per day in 2026, with the Middle East and Asia-Pacific seeing the steepest consumption drops. The economic stakes behind all of this were enormous. During the 40-day war, Iran earned about $9 billion from crude exports, exceeding its daily profits before the start of the conflict. The U.S. blockade was expected to cut about $150 million a day in oil revenue for Tehran. That was the lever Washington was pulling. Starve the Iranian war machine of cash and force a deal. But the blockade was already rippling beyond Iran. The U.S. naval blockade of the strait moved the situation from a price shock to a structural disruption of global trade, said Raj Abrol, chief executive of risk platform Galytics. The impact went well beyond energy prices, rippling through shipping routes, insurance premiums, supply chains, and input costs across every sector. About 190 million barrels of Iranian crude remained at sea, with an estimated 50 million barrels west of Singapore and 140 million barrels east of it, and most of it was destined for China, according to Homayoun Falakshari, head of oil analytics at Kepler. The passage of the Rich Starry did not end the crisis. It deepened it. It showed that the blockade had limits. It showed that China, which depends heavily on Iranian oil, was not prepared to let American naval power dictate the movement of its shipping fleet. And it showed that the Strait of Hormuz had become something more than a waterway. It had become a battlefield of wills between the world's two largest powers. U.S. military officials said there was continued engagement and forward motion on trying to reach an agreement. And Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said efforts were still underway to resolve the conflict. The diplomats were still talking. But out on the water, where the Rich Starry cut through the gray morning sea and sailed past the American naval line, the message had already been delivered. China had moved. The world was watching what Washington would do next.